Hello and welcome. It's lovely to have your company. My name's Morag and I'm calling in from the unceded lands of the Gubbi Gubbi, a place called Crystal Waters Permaculture Village in southeast Queensland, Australia. This session is our monthly permaculture masterclass hosted by the Permaculture Education Institute, and I've been so delighted by the response that we've had to this topic, which is permaculture and rewilding. These permaculture masterclass sessions are hosted by the Permaculture Education Institute. They're always free and online every month. And thank you to anyone who donated when you signed up. The money that is collected there goes directly to our registered charity called the Ethos Foundation, which we send 100% across to support, and in this case, our rewilding project in a refugee settlement in Uganda. And so that will be going over in this next week. I think there was something around $550, which is going to help to do a rewilding project in a refugee settlement in Uganda. So thank you so very much. Now, this topic, rewilding, is a topic that I am super excited about because since I began my adventures with permaculture over 3 decades ago, I always saw it very much as a way of thinking about how we as humans can diminish our footprint on the planet so that there's more space for life to thrive, all life to thrive. And that if we can meet our needs in the smallest place possible, in a beautifully abundant but compact way, there's so much more space for habitat restoration, for rehydration, for reforestation, regeneration. And so when I started to hear this movement of rewilding rippling around the world, I felt that there's this very close alignment between permaculture and rewilding. So I've invited 2 wonderful guests here today to explore this topic with me, and I'll introduce them to you in a moment. But what I would like to do is to invite you to drop into the chat where you're calling in from. I'm from, like I said, from the unceded lands of the Gubbi Gubbi, which is the Indigenous country where I'm seated, and it's a place called Crystal Waters Permaculture Village. Now, this place here, in fact, and I probably won't tell the story about this, maybe for another time, but Crystal Waters started out as basically a degraded piece of farmland. And over the last 3 decades, it's transformed into this incredible wildlife reserve where, I just look out my window and there's kangaroos and wallabies everywhere. The other day, there was an endangered turtle at my back door trying to lay her eggs. And everywhere I look, there is just, this morning I woke up at 4:30 and I just felt like going outside and lying in the garden because the symphony of birds was extraordinary, and it's just this beautiful place that has been rewilded by a community of people over 3 decades. I want to introduce Maddie and Dorrit. Now, Maddie is, many of you know, Maddie for the last 3 decades been editing Permaculture magazine and creating well over 100 books about permaculture through permanent publications. So she co-founded that with her late husband, Tim, and has put so much permaculture knowledge and skills and communication out into the world, an extraordinary gift. And Maddie now lives in a woodland in North Devon. And Maya's my daughter, who's on the screen here, who's helping us with the tech. We visited Maddie early this year and wandered through a woodland, and so inspired by the work that she's doing there, or the unwork that you're doing there. Maybe we could talk about that too, in restoring this piece of woodland and caring for this piece of woodland. And my other guest is Dorrit, who is a retired psychotherapist who about 5 years ago took on a farm in North Devon, 178-acre farm, and began to rewild it after being incredibly inspired by Nep Estate and reading the Wilding book by Isabella Tree, and has been working with Derek Gow in her rewilding project since. So thank you to both of you for being here. Maybe we could just begin to open up our conversation. So both Maddie and Dorrit will share a bit about the projects that they're working on, but also we're going to talk a bit more about what is rewilding and how does it relate to permaculture and how you can get involved, and invite you all to ask questions along the way too. So feel free to use the chat to make comments, to ask questions, and we're going to try and keep this really interactive as much as we can. So I'd like first to maybe pass to you, Maddie, just as an introductory comment, like, what is rewilding to you and how does it relate to permaculture?
Thank you. Thank you, first of all, for inviting us, which is great to be here and to meet everyone that's here as well. So I've been thinking a lot about rewilding because my life, before I was introduced to permaculture in the very early 1990s, I was actually a conservationist, and I used to go and volunteer and go and catch things like frogs on sites that were going to be developed, and relocate them with a wildlife trust. And one of the first things I did when I actually got a little bit of land was to take something that was industrial agriculture with Tim, my husband, and seed a wildflower meadow and combine a native wild chalk downland wildflower meadow, repairing the soil with forest gardening. So I've never been a fully fledged conventional edible landscaper. I've always wanted to have the biodiversity as a primary aim in anything that I've designed. And in 2022, I moved to North Devon, and I realised that I was like at the epicenter of this British rewilding movement, which is very much inspired by Derek Gow, that Derek will talk about. She'll talk about him a little bit in a minute, but he's the guy that breeds the beavers and the storks that went to NEP. So he's kind of like one of the most important primary experimenters of rewilding in Britain. So with permaculture, we have zone 5, and it's the thing beyond the woodlot in the farm design. It's the last concentric circle in our design, as far away from the homestead as possible. Excuse me. And to me, this is linear thinking. And it isn't really a true representation of how it works. And also, I don't think it needs to be like that. So for me, the wild space needs to permeate every zone in permaculture. It even needs to permeate this zone, the zone 00. And we need, our biointensive gardens, our forest gardens, our food forests, our woodlots, our pastures. We need to have wilding strategies in all of those, because we've got the 6th mass extinction on our hands. We've got, in the UK, 60% of the insect population has collapsed in the last 20 years. We have an enormous, huge problem about extinction going on hand in hand with climate change, which is pressing all the levers of extinction at the same time. And I can explain how I'm collecting the data for that later on. And so as permaculturists, it's not only our job to sort of move away from fossil fuels and destructive ways of living in terms of, not cycling resources and becoming the most ecological people possible. We also need to put back in this place of reciprocity as much opportunity for nature to thrive as possible. And so for me, this is, we've had various stages of permaculture. We had permaculture 1, which was tree crops and sustainable agriculture and homestead design. We then, from about 2006, we started to seriously look at social permaculture, community forestry, indeed, with permaculture principles and people care. And now this dimension of fair shares, it's not just about economic fair shares. This is fair shares with all the other non-human species on the planet. And so I see this as the next dimension of permaculture, part of its evolutionary process, and it needs to be planetary. It can't just be, obviously industrial societies need to look very hard at this, but it needs to be a planetary approach. Otherwise, we are going to be part of the sixth mass extinction, and that means bye humans, or bye the majority of humans, and we're seeing that already in what's happening with the climate. So, without being too doomy, I wanted, I'd like to also tell the good stories about how quickly ecosystems regenerate when we do the right thing. And people think rewilding's about just like putting up fences and walking away and doing nothing. But Derek and myself on a smaller scale can tell you that there's some fundamental strategies and principles at work that we can adopt that completely dovetail in with permaculture as designing using nature as a model, to kickstart ecosystems and to get rewilding really going quickly on land. And that's all I'll say for the moment.
Thank you, Maddie. I mean, you're right. This idea of actually needing to take rewilding and permaculture out to this global context is so important. I mean, I was just looking up some figures before, and the average abundance of mammals, birds, reptiles, fish, and amphibians has decreased by 70% since 1970. That's insane. Livestock makes up 62% of mammals, humans 24%, and wild mammals are only 4% of mammals on the planet. We've become so domesticated, we've become so depleted in biodiversity that this work is essential, and it does take a rewilding of our consciousness as well as our actions, and in all dimensions, from urban to rural and everything else in between, from our schools to our workplaces to everything that we do, to really be embracing this concept of rewilding. So I want to turn to you, Derek. What got you into rewilding? I mean, from being a psychotherapist to being a passionate rewilder. Now, please can you share a little bit about that journey?
I guess all the things you've said, becoming aware of the real emergency we're in, and the loss of life all around, but also living in London, of a feeling of living in a static, stony environment. And when you go out in nature, you come into fields which are clipped, with clipped hedges, and are completely industrialized. And as a family, we wanted to do something. It started in sort of about 10 years ago. And first it was having a woodland. And then, as Maddie mentioned, this fantastic book, Wilding by Isabella Tree, which is the story of how they started to rewild a 3,000-acre estate, came out. And slightly pretentiously, perhaps, I said, that's what we're going to do. And Charlie Burrell led us to Derek Gow. So in 2019, having no idea, I mean, I'm not an ecologist. I wanted to study zoology as a kid when I was young, but with the help of, because I think that's the thing, you feel that somebody who doesn't know that much, you can still leave things alone, because rewilding is not about necessarily knowing and doing. It really is about setting up a structure. Like in psychotherapy, you have a room and you set up a structure and things can happen. And it's the same in rewilding. You set up a fencing. And one thing which is very interesting, I think, in rewilding is that we've worked the land so hard and it's so enslaved that you have to disrupt. You have to change the structures. You have to bring life back in. You almost have to allow nature to be alive again, to do its thing, because it isn't. And once that's done, you can sit back and you can watch. So, I mean, I've learned a lot in those 5 years, you can imagine. We arrived from London onto a moor, what was a moor, which was a sheep farm in mid-Devon, not far away from Maddie. and surrounded by quite a few people who have been starting to rewild. And it was Derek really who, we had a first meeting. We bought the farm in October 2019. And we had this absolutely extraordinary meeting with Mick Bracken from the Woodland Trust, who's been very helpful and very active here, and Derek Gow. And our farm, I mean, you'll see it on a picture, and I won't talk too much about it, but it was very impacted woodland. And so we started to be experimental, slightly destructive, exploding a woodland, and it was really exciting. I won't say that much more because I think we talk a bit more later on. Yeah.
Yeah, we have your series of pictures to share and to show people what's going on. So maybe we could thank you both for introducing how you got into rewilding and what it means to you. Maybe Maddie, did you want to share sort of a bigger picture overview of what you see as being rewilding, some key points?
Yeah. So Dorette mentioned has just mentioned Derek Gow. So yeah, there is this assumption that this, when we rewild, we just stop doing everything completely, and it isn't like that at all. So the most famous aspect of rewilding is the reintroduction of apex predators and keystone species, like, for instance, beavers, and discussions about wolves in Scotland. And that's kind of wildcats, and that's kind of the kind of page grabbing concept of rewilding. And Derek will tell you about the experience of actually getting a license and putting a beaver family on the farm and what it's done, because it's utterly transformational to that landscape. But in essence, when we can't have beavers, so I only have like 12 acres, so it's a small woodland. So for me I have to be the apex species, mostly in my woodland. So one of the other critical things is what we do with our rivers. So recently I was in the Wye Valley, which the Wye is the most magnificent river that is the border of Wales and England, and it had broken its banks and flooded. And this is a fairly common thing. And when it gets really bad, it floods whole towns and like Gloucester, and is quite devastating, the effect of the floods. And obviously anyone who's listening to the news will know about Valencia in Spain and how that flooding incident has been devastating. And what we've done with our rivers is we've turned them into massive drains and culverts. And so the idea of rivers is very industrial, that we straighten them out and we treat them like they're drains that are just to move water off landscape. And that's not their function in nature. So, we want to create more riparian buffers, more banks, more flooding zones, more wiggly rivers. We don't want straight drains, because we need rivers to wiggle and slow down as they meander and spill sediment onto the banks and collect the resources that the river brings to land. And so another rewilding strategy is to break field drains as well, because with particularly industrial arable agriculture, the primary aim is to get the water off the land so that we can plough and grow annual grains and other crops. And so the field drains just inundate water into all the watercourses, which then become swollen and destructive on land. And so one of the big strategies is to make leaky dams. And of course, this is what beavers do. And the beavers do it fabulously well. But if we can't have a beaver, we have to become the beaver. So I've been making very small leaky dams on my property and what they do is they collect sediment, they slow down the flow in times of flood, they slow down They gather and retain the water in times of drought. So they keep a sort of average flow down a stream or a river. They create areas, pools where fish can breed. They collect pollution, and they also build the banks up around them. And then when we do have flood, the water spills over at each leaky dam a certain amount, and floods a sort of sacrificial area that actually becomes even more biodiverse ecologically. And you don't get these massive inundations in one area of weakness in the flow of the whole water body. So that they do everything to mitigate flood and drought, and they clean up the river. And beavers are so clever, basically, and they create areas where fish can breed. And within a year of making leaky dams on my little stream, and it is a really little stream, I had trout fry breed, coming into the stream. It was beautiful. Another thing that a lot of people do is they make small ponds and scrapes and bigger ponds, depending on the side of the property. But just a scrape in the land, so it's not a permanent pond or a dam. It's just a ephemeral pond that amphibians can come into and breed, and then move away again. Because when we start mixing up fish and amphibians, of course, the fish love to eat all the amphibians in their early life cycles. So it's great to have these small ephemeral ponds that dry out in the summer, but are available in the breeding season for various different species, and things like, water diving beetles and so forth. And of course, they then make the land damper, and that kickstarts woodland regeneration as well. So the other thing is, Derek's going to talk about this and show slides, so I'm not going to steal her fire, but the idea of letting trees fall in a woodland, and particularly where we live in a very intensely populated region of deer. So a lot of our natural regeneration gets nibbled, particularly by roe deer in our area. But when you've got fallen trees and you don't just tidy them up and you leave them, or indeed, as Derek's done, you deliberately fell them, the deer don't like climbing over the branches. And so underneath the fallen tree, you get all this reseeding, natural regeneration of an area. And you don't have to plant trees. And I've got 2 acres on my land, which is a small acreage. And it was clear felled in 2016. And we did a quadrant survey there. And the regeneration rate of silver birch, which is a pioneer tree, is something like 3,300%. It's so successful in that area compared to what a human might come and plant. And I recently had it surveyed with the Forestry Commission. And basically the story is it's doing incredibly well. It's going to be a lovely little woodland. But that's because it's been allowed to grow brambles, which will then be shaded out as the pioneer species of trees and the climax species, which in this land is oak, come and form a canopy and shade out the brambles. But at the moment, the brambles are nature's tree guard, and they keep the deer away from killing the new growth. So, obviously plant native trees is utterly obvious. We have people growing wildflower meadows and then cutting silage, not cutting silage on regular cuts, but cutting hay at the end of the season, allowing ground nesting birds to fledge, making green hay, and holistically planned grazing so mob grazing, herds of herbivores, and I've actually seen a fascinating agroforestry project that is replanting natives in fenced rows, which are then used to mob. And there's all sorts of research about the productivity of milking cows who have access to shade, the amount that you don't have to feed livestock if it has shelter, shade from hot sunlight, and critically in our climate, it's cold winds that if you get down to 0% centigrade, it's something like you have to feed your cows 50% more food in the winter if they're not shaded and protected from cold winds. So there's all sorts of, this is the Organic Research Centre here, are categorically proving that a mixture of pasture with native trees is actually going to save in the long term the farmer money and provide minerals and medicinals for livestock to browse. And the other research is that there's less necessity to worm animals when they're able to browse things like willow, which no, it's not willow. Sorry, that's an anti-inflammatory. There are other trees that are natural wormers. So there's all sorts of sort of economic advantages to putting livestock into semi-rewilded systems. And then, of course, species reintroduction. We need to do everything we can. And that's what I've been focusing in my little wood, is identifying and surveying the rare species here and doing absolutely everything I can to increase the breeding populations by creating habitat and then collecting the data and feeding it back into, we've got national databases for dormice, and Direct's doing that as well, and for a bird that comes up from West Africa, which is a beautiful bird called the pied flycatcher. So I'm involved in collecting data for that, and also bats every year. And I think that's going to be a really important aspect of our permacultural observation, is not just to look and translate that into our own designs, but to collect data and feed it into appropriate organisations so that we can show the effects of climate variations in breeding populations. So that's kind of, there's more, and I'm going to stop talking now, but that's, I hope that gives you an idea of strategies when we're designing, so that we can design rewilded systems alongside a more edible type permacultural landscape.
Thank you so much, Maddie. You know, like the principles of rewilding align so closely to the work of permaculture. What I really like what you were just saying then too was about adding those things like collecting the data, like really being part of this collaborative, you know, national effort to rewild, to bring back. And it's about, you know, working together for the common good, for the biodiversity, for abundance. And the other thing was around this research and collaborative research around seeing what's happening in terms of, you know, is this also economic for farmers to do? Because I guess that's one of the problems that has been faced. Well, what happens if we plant up all this space with trees? Our farming systems will become uneconomic. And I wonder whether you've got much of a reflection on how that conversation's going in your part of the world these days. Dorrit, you're nodding. Did you want to respond to that?
I did, yes, because what is very interesting with the financial gain or profit is that NEP Estate was a loss-making enterprise. I think they had £1 million debt when they sold all their equipment in 2000, and they built up the business, the rewilding business, very much based on safaris. They have a safari every day. You go and watch. They have nightingales. They have I learned the little bit I learned before I bought the farm from them. I went to about 5 safaris, one for large landowners owning a tiny little garden in Hampstead, London. So they actually have made a huge amount of financial profit. They also have a tourist business. They have shepherd's huts, tree houses. And now they have also a restaurant and a market garden. So in a way, they've gone from rewilding into more, if you want, permaculture, into gardening. Because the reproach has always been, what about growing food? Isn't it? So a lot of the rewilding, and then there's all the grants, the carbon capture and those kind of grants you can get. Because there's also, I'm a small fry. I have just 178 acres, and we just did it as a family. But now, inspired by NEP, there are people who buy big estates. And there are 3 of those now in England, and they literally finance it through those avenues. But it's not productive. The idea is not, I mean, one of the productive things that NEP has is beef, is animals, is because we have no wolves. So they have longhorn cattle. I mean, we were talking about the strategies of rewilding. What you do with the rewilding, you need the animals to work the land. And you usually have longhorn, you have cows, which we don't have because they're a lot of work. You have pigs, which we do have, 2 beautiful Tamworth sows, and ponies. And then the beavers are sort of an extra. So I think in terms of money, I mean, it is creating nature for people to see what nature can do. I will talk a little bit more what we've done here, but when people come, we do, with the Wildlife Trust, we organize walks because the beaver area is impressive. And people come in and say, this is such a mess. This is so messy. And I say, this is so beautiful. We're not used to a landscape that's alive. We are living in some sort of artificial thing. Synthesized, no control. Huh?
Control.
A park.
Yes, a park. That's right. And when you come from a country like Australia and you come across to the UK, you feel it a lot. And when I hear, people talking about the wilds of the Scotland, and I'm looking at, I just see deforestation and eroded landscapes, and I think, and part of me wants to love it because I'm meant to love it, but the inside of me is just feeling torn and constricted with this sense of like, this land is crying out for cover to become alive again, for the rivers to be rewilded, the hills to be rewilded, for the place to come alive. So I think there's so much, and going to your place, Maddie, and seeing even just in a small space what was possible. And I did get to NEP while I was there as well, and saw what was going on, and walked through places like Stephen Harding's down near Schumacher College, what he's doing with that, and it's in a short period of time, what transformation is possible is really amazing. And it's really part of that rehydration of the landscape, and, adding the organic matter and really tending to, what you're saying, the succession planning. And the reason I'm mentioning that is because there's a question, quite a few questions in the chat around what is a leaky dam? And, or how do you make one, I think was the question. So, Maddie, what did you do to make your little stream a leaky dam?
I tell you what, I'll just show you a quick picture. This is a very modest one, okay? And this is built from material that was around me. So it's on a tiny stream. But I've seen some, massive ones on rivers that are much more exciting. So it is literally a whole load of fallen trees put across the stream, and it allows the water still to flow, but it slows the flow down significantly. And when you look at the water here is crystal clear. But if you look behind the dam, you'll see the banks behind are really muddy, and that's where the sediment, because the water's slowed down, the sediment has been able to deposit on the banks around just before the dam. And so there are pools beneath the dam that are quite deep and much slower pools either side. And this is very much a microcosm leaky dam, because you can have them on a much bigger stream and in times of flood holding back a vast amount of water, but they change the flow of the river and they stop bank erosion, and that's the critical thing. I think that's
thank you, Maddie. So it's a simple concept, and I've even put them into gullies where there's not necessarily constant flow of water, whereas just like temporary flow, and it helps to build up the organic matter behind it, and then other things that, as you're saying, a moister landscape starts to happen, which changes the possibilities for what can grow there. So I'll share my screen now for your slides.
That's me with my children. I just wanted to say, I don't see it so much as rewilding strategies. I see it almost as nature-led approaches, that you actually undo what we've done. You'll see this is what we bought, what is around the red, and it is basically a green desert, and we think that is nature. It's got a very tight wood belt, and it's got green, it looks the same as everywhere, that eaten down green pasture. There's just a few pictures of the woodland. Now, the pond you see on the right and the very dense forested bit, this is where we release the beavers. There's another pond hidden behind the trees. And when we had this first meeting in 2019, the excitement of both Derek Gow and Nick Fracken and us to explode this woodland, to actually make space for the woodland. So what we did, there was a lot of talk about elephants and mammoths, and what happened, here you see how the pond looked like with an island. There is no life in this. You can see that there's no life in this. There's no chance for anything to come about. It was very dark and overgrown. And so what happened is we got an ecological contractor in who took out 60% of the trees. Now you see, we pulled a lot of the Sika spruce over, so there's a root ball exposed. And then, as Maddie said, all those heaps are heaps of the wood piled up. So they make like a lattice work to exclude, to keep the deer out and to hopefully allow the trees to grow. Now, what was interesting with this, it was terribly exciting to do, because it was such a sense of opening things up for nature to take place. And it took a while. It was an unbelievable mess. We live in a very muddy place here in Mid-Devon. But it is now absolutely magnificent. And this was mainly done to open up the whole area around the ponds so the beavers could come. So what you see here is the area which got fenced. We have a fence, we have an enclosure, which is about 60 acres for the beavers to come in. This is what the heap looks like from closer up. So that green field you saw before now has 25 of those heaps. And Derek was saying they're all different sizes, different intensities, densities, different heights. And of course, it's dying wood. It changes as it goes along. And the trees you see standing up, they were all put into holes of 2-3 meters. They're not alive. But they're wonderful perches for owls, for kestrel, for buzzards, and for all sorts of birds to come in. And you see how much of the grass is sort of shifting. It has rushes and all sorts of things. No, the trees were not exotic. I'm just seeing the question. What you get here is a lot of plantation with Sika spruce, which is the sort of commercial tree. And our plantation was very overgrown. It had like the sort of 3 rows of Sika spruce, 3 rows of broadleaf trees. And we basically took out all the Sika spruce. And the idea behind it was you don't put anything in and you don't take anything out. So that was the sort of philosophy, if you want, of how we approach the land. And so we were left with the question, what do we do with all the felled trees? And then we had a big storm in 2020, I think, which then we had a lot of windfall. So this is a before and after, exactly the same spot. On the left, you see how the trees were in rows. And on the right, you see what it looks like now. So when you pull over the tree, you have the root ball exposed. You give also bees and insects a chance, ideally also birds, but we don't have them yet, like sand martins, to make themselves homes. And you have tiny little ponds at the bottom of the tree. So from a land like it looks like on the left, which is just flat, you suddenly have a little mini habitat where you have a pond, you have lots of wood, and you can see the amount of vegetation growing up all around it. And that's 3 years. And it's fabulous. And this is all the work you do. That was our beaver release. We started, as I said, we bought the farm in 2019. And by December 2020, we had done the enclosure. We had managed to make, and we had opened up all the woodland. And this is the first beaver. We released 3 beavers, a dad with his 2 kids of 7 months. And unfortunately, the dad died, or he disappeared. We never saw him again after a week or so. And then 2 weeks later, we released a black beaver, Shadow, into the same area. So we had 3 beavers to start with. Interestingly, I mean, Maddie talked a lot about the importance of water. We sadly don't have a river. We have 2 ponds and ditches. It's very wet and there's always enough water. And we broke in the enclosure, we broke the drainage pipes. We made a few ponds, we made scrapes. And interestingly, we made the beavers a lodge, because they arrived in December and we wanted them to have an own home already. Interesting, they didn't do a huge amount in their first year. And then they started building. And that's the beavers. Very early on, hanging out. And I have to say, they are magnificent animals, because they are so, I'm in love with beavers. They are so busy. And they're so modest, and their effect on the landscape is absolutely phenomenal. I don't know how they know. I asked them, there is the Beaver King they call him Beaver King, Gerhard Schwab, and I asked him once, what do beavers think? How do they manage to make a landscape like that? Because from having had 2 ponds, we now have about 9 or 10 huge dams, and probably as many ponds, and they're expanding. By now we have 9 beavers. We had 1 kid 2 years ago, 2 kids 1 year ago, and 3 kids this year. And it's a family business. They all keep on working. They go up the ditches and then they go also down. So they're now starting to expand 100 meters away from their original pond. And they go into the landscape. And of course, what they're doing is they're making water channels to find their food. So they felled a lot of trees, they eat willow. So the landscape has been really re-wetted. And we keep a lot of water on the land. And our neighbor cluster member, Ollie, said to us once when there was a lot of rain, he said it was the first time his river didn't flood. That he felt, because we keep so much water on our land, that it actually absorbed the water and released it much more slowly. So here you just see how it grows up in 3 years. How much happens when you don't cut it. Next picture, please. And this is around the beaver pond. And you see how much they felled. In the right picture, all those fluffy trees have gone because they've been either eaten and or used as building for the dams. Now, the other thing we did is we green hayed. When you have pasture which has been eaten by sheep and you have ryegrass, it's like velvet. It's so dense, nothing can grow. There's no diversity at all. So what you see here is we've harrowed the land, and then we seed it here. That's my dogs. They're my helpers. This was with the help of Tom Parsons and the Devon Wildlife Trust, who is very active in helping landowners with green hay. And what we've done here is we've cut it, the fields very short, and then you see the heaps of green hay. These are meadows which were cut, full calm grass meadows. We live in a moor area which is calm grass, and the calm grass meadows have been 92% of them have been destroyed. So the Devon Wildlife Trust is supporting landowners to re-meadow it. And we've done probably 15 hectares of it by now. So this is what happens. You then spray the meadow onto the land, and then you get either the sheep or cows to graze it. And it creates a biodiversity. You then have yellow rattle, you have birdfoot trefoil, you have a whole different amount of species of wildflowers, which of course bring in insects. They bring in birds, they bring in life. Because ryegrass doesn't offer anything to anybody except to cows and sheep and farmers. So that's what you get. You get a huge variety. And nitrogen fixes. I think that's, I'm not very good with my plants, but I think is that eyebright, Maddie? We have a lot, and you get, I think because it was a calm grass meadow, because it's been disturbed, you also get a lot of the plants which are still in the seed banks coming back. First orchids was incredible, joyful. These are the orchids which are in the area, which are just fabulous. And they take a long time to come back. So that's our first orchid, which arrived after just a year and a half. This is the other area. As I said to you, we have one area, about 60 acres, which is the enclosure where the beavers are, where we have pigs and ponies and no badger. And this is the open area where we have no beavers yet. And here we had a big field of 20 acres, which you can see is pretty boring. And we started making ponds at the advice of Derek Gow. We had a walk with Derek Gow and Will Bond and all the people who've done all the work on the woodland. We had 3 huge bulldozers on it. I mean, it was an enormous amount of work when they did it. And they saw this field and thought, this would be fantastic for ponds. Let's do a few ponds. And not being a planner, I said, yes, let's do a few ponds. And it ended up being 21 ponds. So the field is transformed. It's got dragonflies, the birds, lots of birds, the swallows feed. It's got skylarks. It's become much more alive. Having said all that, I would like much more life on it. It would be wonderful if the lapwings and the curlews and these creatures came back. But for that, you need to have a wider landscape, which is more alive.
But Dora, you say the birds have come back, but you stand in that field and you see these huge flocks of goldfinches crossing the land. They're like a murmuration. They're extraordinary. I've never seen such big flocks of finches on the land. And you feel like you're in a place that's much more primeval. It's so different from even a nature reserve, even some nature reserves. It's an extraordinary feeling. I mean, I think I just wanted to stress that yes, it's birds, but it's big flocks crossing the land now because of the ponds and the wildflowers and the insects.
Yes, it's definitely increased because we had one skylark in 2020, and we now have something like 50 pairs. So the increase of abundance when you leave the land alone is extraordinary. But I was just thinking when you said that, Maddie, I was thinking of Nep and Morag. You've been to Nep. It's a landscape which we know from Africa or from India. It's not a landscape which is known. I don't know how you are in Australia. Maybe you have more wilder looking landscapes. But in England, the national parks don't look anything like that. They're not left alone. So yeah, it's nature re-owning and doing its magic, really. that's the field with the ponds in the snow. So it's much more vegetation around it. And this was all done in the first 2 years. So this is what I would say was all the disruption happening on the land to undo, in some ways, the structures or the restrictions maybe only 70 years of farming has imposed on it. It's just, and I think, as Maddie said in the slides, once you've done the work, you literally don't do that much anymore. We also planted 10,000 trees. Besides felling them, we planted lots of trees. So the thing to do is the sort of tree care, but nature springs back, animals spring back, and the soil springs back. These are my workers. These are 4 Exmoors. The one on the left is still a foal. I was given them 2 of them by Derek Gow, and then 2 of them by a friend who's got a big moor nearby. And the pigs come from Nep, thanks of Derek. We got 2 Tamworth sows. And you see in the front the rootling they do. They are incredibly important, because if you don't have animals on the land, it just grows over, and it grows, you lose a little bit of fertility, and also it then, in the end, it becomes a sort of woodland. So they keep it all at bay. And of course, in here we also have deer, because they jump the fences. We have roe deer and we have red deer. We were very lucky when we bought the farm. We were in the middle between those 2 wonderful people. On the right is Ollie Walker, and on the left is Val Green. And Val has a 300-acre woodland. She planted up with her husband. It had been a farm before that. She planted in the 90s, and she's now rewilding her woodlands. They've just mammoth 15 acres of woodland with Mick Bracken and the Woodland Trust. Ollie is a regenerative farmer, and he's got access to the Little Dart, which is the river, and it's got a beautiful wild area down there, and he's got beautiful meadows, and he's put herbal lays in. He does agroforestry, and he's got a small flock of Red Devon cows who graze from time to time, because we need a bit more grazing, and he's got the sheep. And what is really important, I think, with rewilding, because it is a bit unusual, and we are living in a farming landscape, and farmers, and then some of the farmers farm in a very unsympathetic, very chemical way. It's really important to have the network of friends and people who have the same passion, and have also a sense of how incredibly alive a landscape becomes when it's left alone. And behind it, you see the beaver dam. Thank you.
Thank you, Dorrit. And been studying with the group of young folk around the world at the moment, systems thinking with Fritjof Capra. And one of the key things around, how to activate change is this notion of disruption, that's how change happens. When we do disturb a system, it's not just this linear process. We do need to have that for some learning to take place, for some transformation to be activated. Imagine it might feel a little bit awkward to do some level of disruption, but to see what it actually can create in such a short period of time, by digging the ponds, by creating the space, by adding all of that material. I mean, those things that all the logs that you put in the middle of the fields, I mean, all of that's just breaking down and feeding the mycelial networks and creating so much food for so many things. I mean, you were talking about how many homes it created for so many species, the birds and the bees and little ponds underneath. There was so much about that. And, if someone might look at it without a rewilding frame and go, oh, there's a tree that's fallen over, let's get rid of it, or let's burn it. I mean, often people pile up trees in the middle of a field and then just burn them. And, I think what you're demonstrating there is a really beautiful shift in actually how simple rewilding can be, in a way. It's not a complicated thing. And what I loved what you said was about you don't put anything in and you don't take anything out. Like all of that food for the system is coming from within the system itself. It's just kind of helping it to reconfigure and putting the energy in to help nature, to help activate that nature healing potential. Like that's what rewilding is essentially, as I understand, is like helping nature to heal. and just activating that process, and then, you know, stepping back and being the tender of that as opposed to the controller of it. I'd love to invite people to be asking questions, to, you know, if you've got some questions, either to start popping your hand up or to drop it in the chat, and we'll be looking to that there. But I wonder, Maddie, whether there was anything that you wanted to pick up, any threads from a, you know, commenting from a permaculture perspective, or in relation to other things that are going on in your place that you've noticed, because it's quite a different scale from 12 acres to 130 acres or 178 acres. And also just this importance too of the networks. You know, I think this is a really interesting thing that's happening in the UK at the moment, is these rewilding networks. And I wonder whether you could just speak a little bit more about how that's working too.
So there's various different, there's an informal rewilding network in Devon, which is a WhatsApp group, and people invite each other to their places, and they give free tours and cups of tea and bring cake and stuff like that. And that's quite an informal one. It's not a funded one run by an NGO or anything. And it's all about sort of sharing experiences and skills and practical stuff, like where to put ponds and how to design them, and why not to put ponds in certain places, and talking about livestock, and like Derek mentioned, Tamworth pigs being good pigs to have. But she'd also say that she wouldn't mind sharing her pigs if that was possible, because pigs have quite a big impact. But if you don't have pigs, you don't get reseeding in the same way. So you're talking about pattern disruption. You need the pigs because they disrupt the pattern of the pasture, and they allow the germination of new species. And they reactivate the seed bank as well. But you have to rest the land as well as disrupt it. And there's always that balance between resting land and disrupting land, so that you get a maximized ecology. Because when a tree falls, it's a huge pattern disruption, because that's how we get clearings, and we get light in the canopy and woodland, and we get water as Derek observed, and more mud, which is useful as habitat. So again, that's a huge pattern disruption. But to go back to, human pattern disruption, so there are also the Wildlife Trust in Devon organises events, and that's how I met Derek, through a Wildlife Trust funded visit to her place for other people in the area that have small patches of land, and bigger ones could go and actually see for themselves what was happening there. And that is a very generous thing for the person running the project to open up fundamentally their home and their beloved land. And let's be clear, not everyone's enthusiastic about this, and some people can be very rude about rewilding, as we've experienced. And a lot of more conventional farmers say, well, what are we going to eat if you rewild everything? What are we going to eat? But you look at industrial agriculture. What is it growing? The field next to me is growing winter barley that has been left as set aside, that will be ploughed up next year. And it's been left as a short-term funded wildlife project that will do nothing in the long term. So that is money paid to the farmer to sow something and then not crop it, but let the pheasants, which are a game bird and not indigenous to this land, come along and thrive on it, and then eat all of our indigenous amphibians and reptiles. So, how stupid is that farming policy? What else do we grow? We grow rapeseed oil, We grow biomass for a biomass boiler that does some sort of combined heat and power, and then puts quite a toxic material back onto the land as fertilizer, using enormous trucks that roar down roads, small country roads. I mean, I look critically at the farming. We put vast numbers of sheep onto the land, which compact the land, and then the farmer has to spray the land with herbicides and fertilizers to regenerate the pasture. You know, when you actually look at industrial agriculture as a system without funding from central government, it is completely and utterly inefficient and utterly destructive, and it is the primary cause of insect decline. It just is. That's the truth of it. And once we have insect decline, we have decline of all the species stacked above insects in an ecosystem. It is a disaster. And we are beginning to have proof that other ways of doing things, and you mentioned this, there are farms that do biointensive market gardening, food forests, and silviculture that use tiny fractions of the total land holding, and the rest is left for nature. So, and they are profitable and provide employment and produce food. So, you know, it is possible. We're just hypnotized at the moment by chemical agriculture. So this gathering of wildlife trust funded events, North Devon Biosphere also funds sort of facilitation, educational projects for people working on rewilding and conservation, and farmers that are interested. They also arrange events. And what it's done is it's built this informal community of like minds, and this educational opportunity where you can go and see for yourself what a leaky dam does, how to create more rare species breeding on your land by going and seeing someone who's doing similar, who's got more experience and knows what to do with a specific species. And we need this in every area of our respective countries. And so, you know, we've got these skills. And the other thing is it builds community, because let's be honest, when you live in the middle of a woodland or on a farm in a very wet and sometimes quite dark climate, it can be really lonely. And it creates community. So it's not just about education and information sharing. It's about, excuse me, us guys meeting up and making friends and then supporting each other and sharing ideas and inspiring each other to keep going against the face of crazy in agricultural policies in our country, and a certain amount of criticism that it's not economic, that it doesn't grow food, and that we're dilettantes that don't know what we're doing, because we've all received all of that criticism, some more than others.
Yeah.
Can I say the community aspect? We've got to rewild our community.
Yes, indeed.
Derek Gow is an incredible character. He's a bit Hemingway-like, and he's very outspoken, very direct, and he's fabulous. He was a sheep farmer who turned. He's got a huge amount of experience, and he does conferences. He does always a rewilding conference, and he invites, such an extraordinary amount of people who've been there from the very beginning, whether it's Charlie Burrell or Ted Green, extraordinary people. And he also did a wolf conference where they were all about the reintroduction of the wolves and how the wolves, experience of wolves in Holland. And what is really important with that is what Maddie said, is that you do not have it in the media. You don't have that in-depth information. We had Roy Dennis on, who talked about the reintroduction of the white eagle and of ospreys. And they've done it since the 80s. So you have people talk about things, which you so that's incredibly inspiring. And of course, we're now, there's more happening. They were the real pioneers of something before it really happened. And when the land was very, very impoverished. So I think that's another way where people come together.
Yeah, and I think it's so great to be able to open up different farms and have, days where you go and visit each other's places. I think that's essential. There was a question in the chat around, what do we do if we don't have land? We live in the city, and and there was some responses there about, well, get involved in your local bush regen group, a local land care group, which is good. But then the other comments were coming through saying, well, there's a whole lot of glyphosate that happens in there. It's a lot about tree planting, but not so much rewilding. And so, perhaps there is a place then to start urban rewilding projects, like start up your own club, start doing rewilding. It can be micro rewilding. There's a brilliant project in Melbourne, which is a city in the south of Australia, that a friend of mine, Emma Cutting, has created this pollinators corridor for 8 kilometres across the middle of the city from one major park to another. And she's encouraging people all the way across to rewild little patches of garden out the front of their street or in their backyard or on their rooftop, so that there is this rewilding corridor that runs all the way across the city. And so, micro patches, and there's those little micro forests that are, popping up around cities all over the place. So wherever you are, there is a place that you can start to do that, and just find a few friends and get started. Maybe get involved in a community garden down the street. I was involved in Northeast Street City Farm, setting that up. We just had our 30-year anniversary recently, and that, before we got there, was like just a compacted field. Now there is forests and bush tucker orchards and food everywhere, and just, it feels like you're in the countryside, but you're right in the middle of the city, and the transformation has been phenomenal. So get involved in community gardens as well. The other thing that I just wanted to point to in the chat that came through was a reference to Growing on Country, which is a fantastic project course that's set up by an Indigenous woman called Dominic Chen, who's been part of the Permaculture Education Institute. And she's really created this course for anyone to look at the protocols of Indigenous understanding of landscape and how to interact. So check that out. The link's there in the chat as well. Now, have I missed any questions, Maya?
There was a lot of questions about how to do rewilding in suburbs. But also there was one at the very start that was about, from John, what principles should guide human interactions with rewilded areas to ensure respect for wild ecosystems while still ensuring permaculture goals? So, yeah, how to step into the rewilding environment and what attitude to go in with it.
I guess there's a fundamental difference, isn't it, between permaculture and rewilding, and they're both really important. We have two arms, but I think the rewilding ethos is to observe and to not do, but to let nature do it. And then sometimes you need to step in, and I think the smaller the area, the more you need to step in. But it's the basic principle to really think, I'm not doing anything until I really accept I really have to help along. Whereas I guess in permaculture, you're creating an environment. You're more active in, and I might be wrong here, but in having strategies and in encouraging the environment. Whereas I think in rewilding, you let nature do its thing. And you're often surprised because nature does different things from humans, has different ideas or different mechanisms.
Well, and unexpected things happen. That's the big surprise for me, even on a relatively small piece of land. I've, observed species that I never expected to be here. Gobsmacking. So nature does stuff that we really don't expect. And if we interfere with every patch of land, then we don't allow the opportunity for those very unexpected events and developments and evolutions to happen on the land. So somehow, yes, we do need to have a design around where we grow our food, where we grow our fibre, where we grow our building timber and timber for heat and all of these things, and what we leave alone, having kick-started the ecology, and just let ourselves be surprised instead of wanting to control everything.
Yeah.
You know, the trouble with us guys is we come from a culture of command and control, and we have to undo that worldview where we're sort of some kind of sitting at some kind of hierarchical pinnacle of species evolution as the most intelligent, wet-brained, dexterous mammal in the clan, and we need to look at ourselves and think, well, you know, we have a certain type of intelligence, but we are living in a sentient universe that is animated, as your friend, the dear late Stephen Harding, so beautifully put in his book Animate Earth, which I think forever changed the way I saw the world. You know, it's a beautiful book. And we need to really look at ourselves and have some humility. And I loved that Derek Gow, you know, he talks about this and says that we kickstart the ecology as rewilders, and then we step back and we leave it alone because we don't know what's going to happen. We think we're the most important keystone species in the ecology, but perhaps we're not. Often we're not. And stuff happens despite us. But unless we leave nature the opportunity to do what she needs to do, that stuff doesn't happen. So I hear that very much from Derek, this stepping away. It's a humility that I think is very important, that we don't go around permaculturing everything, you know, with some kind of mindset that everything's got to be agroecology or agroforestry or some kind of edible landscaping. It doesn't. You know, you look at the Ferme de Bec au Halloin in Brittany. So, you know, you've got 20 hectares, but only 2 hectares max is intensively cultivated, and the rest is pretty much left.
And I think that brings it beautifully full circle to where we started saying, you know, I think the relationship with permaculture and rewilding is that we do really consciously think about how we can meet our needs as humans in the smallest, most beautiful, graceful way possible, and then activate the rewilding of the rest of the space and bring that wilding into the gardens as well and into our way of being in the world. And that, I think, is where the two come so beautifully together, which also encourages us to think differently about the kind of diet that we consume. Because if we're going to have such a smaller footprint in terms of agricultural footprint, agroecology footprint, we need to have a more plant-based diet. It's not to say that we need to get rid of animals off the landscape. We definitely need the animals on the landscape, but we don't need intensive industrial agricultural systems. And that's, you know, supporting that is what actually ends up creating so much more of the impact. I think we've come to the end of our time. There was a couple more questions. Maybe there's one question that we could just answer if you could quickly respond to it. And it was a question around carbon. I'll just see if I can find it. There's a question about the carbon impact of tree clearance. I just think it's worth maybe having a quick chat about that and what you think about how do we address that. My first response to it, and maybe you can add to this, is, well, in order to actually be removing some of those excess plants, you get more diversity of growth, you get more soil carbon happening, which absorbs more moisture, which creates more soil organic matter, which draws down more carbon. And I wonder whether there's other things going on there that you'd like to add as well.
Well, I would agree with you, because the tree clearance comes because it's a very dead woodland. There's nothing happening like you saw in the picture. And I think you allow the system to work again. So you have a soil, as you said, I mean, which will start to absorb the carbon again, and you're not burning it. I mean, it's a very slow disintegration of the woodland. And I would think if you burn the wood, that releases much more carbon.
Yeah, thanks, John.
But I think leaving a woodland which is not in any way doing anything to anybody, I mean, also has no benefit for wildlife, doesn't really make sense just because it's static in terms of carbon.
Yes, yeah.
Particularly the conifer woodland that you cut and felled is not a native tree. It was a plantation woodland. It has very little wildlife value. There's very little growing on the woodland floor. So I don't know, but I would think that the sequestration rate is incredibly different to a deciduous oak. But there was some really fascinating research, which was the Institut Silva and the University of Liège in Belgium on Le Bec de Feu-Mahallois in Brittany. And they measured soil carbon in the food forest and the more domesticated forest garden, on the silviculture pasture, and also in the very intensively mulched and composted and planted market garden. Hey, yeah, there's the book all about it. I know who published that. And and we have 3 volumes. Third volume's coming in January. Yeah, volume 2. Oh, well done, Morag. But what they found was, and this really surprised them, that you'd expect, say, the rewilded area, the forest garden or the food forest to be where the real carbon sequestration biomass was, because that's where the tree cover is. And they actually found that the soil carbon levels were highest in the mulched market garden area of the farm, because there was so much mycorrhizal activity and so much sequestering in that area. And I did have the statistics at hand at one point, but it was a significant increase in soil carbon. So, we can have our mulched no-dig permaculture beds and our carbon sequestration too. And I think when you look at the biodiversity of Derek's farm, blowing up a few trees and being the woolly mammoth is nothing towards the sort of soil building that happens, because from a compacted monocultural pasture you start to get an extraordinary diversity of wildflowers. The birds land there and they poop and leave their nitrogen, and the voles and the small mammals bloom in that landscape, and then the predators, the birds of prey and the owls come in, and you get all this incredible activity of life, and life sequesters carbon by building soil. So it's not just about trees, it's about the thriving biodiversity of life and all of the sort of trophic cascades of small mammal and bird poo and rotting trees and soil activity of mycorrhiza. And when you do that to land, you really start talking about sequestration. And I think we need to understand that beautiful complexity and those trophic cascades of nutrients and carbon in the soil in a different way to just growing trees. I mean, growing trees are great, and Derek's planted 10,000 at least, let alone nature. I don't know how many nature is planted on your land now, but, we're talking about thousands and thousands of trees that will lock up carbon long after we've gone.
Yeah. And the transformation where we are here too at Crystal Waters, when you walk through, you can feel it under your feet. I mean, you can feel the change. When I first came here, the ground was hard. Now it's soft and alive, and you can feel the aliveness, feel the moisture. The transformation is so tangible. So I need to wrap up this conversation now, and I want to thank you so very, very much, both of you, Dorette and Maddie, for coming and joining us in this conversation here. And I'd like to thank all of you who've come and joined us in this conversation too. There's been so many questions and chat. What I will do is follow up this presentation with the replay, and also links to articles that have been about Derek's work, and also links to the Permaculture magazine, the Permaculture publications, where you can get these books from, and also a copy of the chat too, if anyone wanted to have a look back to any of the other links. So thank you so very much. Please stay in touch with us. We run a masterclass each month. Next month, I'll be running one. It'll be in about 6 weeks' time when I get back from the International Permaculture Conference in Taiwan, and I will run a session and give an update on all the things that are going to be happening there. So I might rope in my daughter Maya, who will be coming with me, and she can share as well alongside me all the things that are happening over in that conference. So again, thank you so much, Dorrit and Maddie. It's just been an absolute delight to have this conversation here today with you, and I hope that you've all enjoyed being part of it and listening. From the comments, there's some really lovely comments. I hope you have a chance, Maddie and Dorrit, just to have a quick look there before you head off. Again, thank you everyone who was able to donate to the Ethos Foundation when you joined. That money will be sent over this week to support a rewilding project that's happening in a refugee settlement in Uganda, and with young people and particularly young women. And so I'm really grateful to both of you for sharing your time here today and to enable us to be able to do that work as well. So so much appreciation to you both.
Thank you so much, Morag. It's been great to be able to talk about this, and appreciate my neighbour's hard work as well.
Thank you so much. All right, take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.